Let's have a look at one thing you can do before you begin working with the text in depth to help make reading academic texts more interesting, more productive, and I hope, easier. My name is Helen Green and I'm from LSE Life, and together we're going to explore and map an academic text. This is a photograph of Andres Gursky called 99 Cent, and I put it here because I think academic texts can sometimes seem like this. There's so much on offer, a lot of similar things, a lot of things you've never seen or used before, and probably more than you could possibly need at any one time. By exploring and mapping the text, you can get a quick, general overview and begin to make some sense of what you find with a map or an outline. You can use this initial exploration to try and figure out what the text has to offer and what you're most interested in learning more about. And this can help you set yourself up to read in a more focused way if you choose to go on into more depth with the text. Some of the things that you can look out for are clues about what the text has to offer, where it comes from, where it's published, who wrote it, what kind of text it is, and what kinds of information or ideas are in there that you can use. And if you've tried the online exercise on setting reading goals, you can also look out for specific things you'd like to know more about. So let's have a first look at this text together. The instructions of the exercise on the LSE Life Moodle page were to take just 5 minutes to explore Muthukrishna and Henrik 2016. We see it here, and I suppose you tried this on your own, and I suppose you did this silently. I'm going to explore this text with you out loud and talk through some of the things that I noticed when I had my first exploration. So, of course, I notice I have a 14-page journal article here, and it's helpful to know what kind of text you're working with. For instance, journal articles often have quite an explicit structure, and they're typically standalone pieces. If it's a chapter from a book, it might be more difficult to make sense of the text by itself, and you might need to have a look at the book, or perhaps the introduction and conclusion chapters, or a book review. There's more advice about how to scan and read entire books on the LSE Life Moodle page. But let's get back to our text. So the first thing that draws my attention is the title and the authors, Innovation in the Collective Brain. And there, one of the two authors is the course convener for the course the reading comes from. So I know if I have specific questions, I can go straight to the author. So I see here that the article appears in the Philosophical Transactions from the Royal Society. So for journal articles, it can be good to know what kind of journal it is. If you notice this for each reading, you'll begin to get an idea of what areas different journals cover. This can be really handy later if you're doing research. If you know a journal covers areas that match your interests, you can search directly in the journal itself. And of course, later on, if you'd like to publish your work, it's good to be familiar with which journals publish which types of work. Notice the general subject areas and some keywords here. Sometimes when you read, you might have some specific reading goals in mind. This is a good way to check whether the article could be particularly relevant to something you're looking for. You can also just use these subjects or keywords to think about how familiar you might be with what you're about to read. Or check to see if these things are entirely new to you. We have an introduction and a figure about causal relationships suggested by the cultural brain hypothesis. Now, I don't know what these are yet. I've only started looking at the article, but the cultural brain hypothesis seems like it could be an important element in this article. Part 2 is about the cultural brain in the collective brain. First subsection is on the evolution of cultural brains. And there seem to be a lot of points about something important here. If I take a quick look at the last sentence, just before the list, I see it's a list of positive correlations. Brain size and cognitive ability, group size, social learning, etc. And then there's another set of important points. I say important because I suppose if they call them out in this way and make them prominent, the authors really want me to have a look. Here too I can have a quick look at the paragraph just before the list and see that these are conditions and prerequisites for takeoff in widespread social learning. The second subsection is about networking cultural brains into collective brains. Part 3 is called Innovation in the Collective Brain. Now, if I remember correctly, this was the title of the article, so I suppose there must be some really good information here. Maybe I'll put a star by section 3, and then later devote some more time to exploring it in more detail in the next phase of, well, exploration. Here's the first subsection of Innovation in the Collective Brain, which is about increasing innovation rates. I see another figure with a curve showing a probability, but for now I'm just glancing. Here are some specific points, examples of factors that increase transmission fidelity. And this section seems the longest one so far, so again, perhaps it's an important one. There's a formula and a figure plotting different languages. It seems to be the relationship between the degree of optimization for information content and the number of speakers in the language. So, for example, here, if I were particularly good with visual data, I might plan to come back to this plot or to that curve to understand more later. Or if I'm not so comfortable with reading visual data, I might choose to focus on something else when I decide to come back later. Part is called The Collective Brain Fuels the Cultural Brain. And here we come across another series of key points in debates about IQ. It seems that we're ending this section on constraining and opening thought spaces, how culture affects culture. The last 3 pages are the references, and this is where I can find out about the ideas that these authors used to develop their own arguments. I can have a quick look here already to see if I spot any work that I've already read or any thinkers that I've heard of already in my course. And it can be interesting to look for any cases or places I already know about to see how these authors use them in their work, or simply see if any of my professors are in the references. So after this first quick look, I have an idea of the landscape of the text. And here you see a very general map. There's an introduction, and then 3 further parts, each with subsections. You might go into a little more detail with your outline or your map. Okay, well, the cultural brain hypothesis is important. In terms of the collective brain, there are correlations between brain size, cognitive ability, etc., those first details that we saw. And then secondly, there was that set of prerequisites in order for human social learning to take off, so to speak. And then that final section about the collective brain fueling the cultural brain had to do with IQ and IQ tests, amongst other things. So this is just one way of drawing your map. It needn't be a list. You might make a drawing or a mind map or a sketch of some type. There are a few other things to notice. Here's a bonus for making it this far in the exercise. Another place you can try to look for this guided tour of what's going on in an article is at the end of the introduction. Always take a minute to check out the last part of the introduction. Authors often take this last opportunity before jumping into the body of the text to tell you what they're trying to do. Let's have a look. Notice the language here. We argue. We outline. We begin by discussing. We summarize and then explain. We sketch and discuss 3 factors. We examine, and then we address something that hasn't been studied enough. Here you see that same passage of text, just a bit more clearly. Can you see here how the authors lead you step by step through what they're about to do in the article? And of course, the abstract is another excellent source to have a very concise summary of the article and its findings. In your opinion, how do they compare? Think back to that Gursky grocery store. The point of this exercise is to avoid zombie reading. And zombie reading for me is going up and down the aisles of the grocery store with no focus. You might end up trying to look at every single line of the text, one after another, maybe even copying down a lot of notes, only to realize that you've been working for hours and you actually have no idea what you've been reading. If you have a map, and if you know a little more about what to expect from the article, you'll be less likely to fall into this habit of passive reading. You'll be less likely to be a zombie reader. So, map out the text to get an overview of what it has to offer before you begin reading in more detail. Now, perhaps you've already had a look at the exercise on setting reading goals on the LSE Life Moodle page. This course description comes from that exercise, and we used it to formulate some specific things we wanted to learn from our reading for that week. Specific reading goals. Think about it. A map, together with a couple specific reading goals, will put you in a much better position to work with an academic text. If you have a clear reason for reading the text, and you know your way around, it's like being equipped with a good shopping list at the grocery store, compared to just wandering in, hungry. Once you've tried both exercises, mapping the text and setting reading goals, put your results side by side. Here on the right, we have our shopping list, our reading goals. And on the left, we have a map of what's on offer in the text, based on some of those things we found in the outline that we just did together. You see that the points about intelligence and IQ tests match up pretty well with our reading goals. We wanted to know, what is IQ and how is it tested? And to what degree did that mean measuring intelligence? We saw in the plot some differences in the efficiency, quote unquote, of different languages plotted against numbers of speakers. And if you remembered from the reading goals, we'd come up with a question about whether any cross-cultural aspects were interesting to consider in thinking about intelligence. Academic texts are often long, complex, specialist material. The subject matter may be new to you, and the language is often unfamiliar. Academic reading is a skill, and it won't be easy at first. I'm not saying that mapping the text for a few minutes is a magic method. It's not a form of speed reading, and I'm afraid it's not a replacement for the careful, detailed reading that you might decide to do on some parts of the text that you map. What I am saying, though, is that after 5 or 10 minutes of scanning the text, reading a few key lines, mapping out the argument and the evidence in the text, you'll be in a much better position to make decisions about what to read and in what order. And when you do read in a detailed way, you'll know the big picture the author is trying to convey. Apart from already being an expert in the field, I think this, combined with setting reading goals, is a really good way to combat zombie reading. If you've already had a look at the video on setting reading goals, you'll know I said that reading goals are like a shopping list that you make before you go to the supermarket. Well, by mapping the text, you now know what they keep in each aisle and section of the supermarket. So, armed with your list, you're ready to go. Setting reading goals or mapping the text? Which one should you do first? There's no one way to go about this. The way I recommend avoiding, though, is simply jumping into the text with no preparation at all and giving no thought in advance. In essence, this is putting the text first. I recommend putting yourself first. The idea here is to take time to think about yourself. What do you already understand? What is it that you don't yet understand, but you're interested in knowing more about? What are you curious about, and what do you want to learn about? Think about the context in which you're reading. Why are you reading this text? Do you just want a quick introduction? Do you need a really detailed account? Or are you doing some informed, in-depth research? Different reasons for reading will help determine how you read the text. Think about the text and its author too. What kind of text is it? What's the author's position? What's his or her main argument? And how do authors structure and develop their arguments? Finally, take some time to think about the context of the author and the text itself. When was it written? What academic disciplines or professional fields inform the structure, the arguments, the findings of that text? Are there some cultural or social or even political considerations around the text or its publication that could be interesting for you to keep in mind? With things like this in mind, you're able to make decisions about how to proceed with using the text. This is part of a critical engagement with the text. And then you approach the text and use it in a way that suits you best on that particular day in the context in which you are reading. Remember, it can be helpful to work with a text in different stages. You don't have to do all this work in one sitting. You might map the text and set your goals for 15 or 20 minutes on one day, and then really get into the text on the next day, maybe when your mind is more fresh and you have some more time. Everyone has their own method and rhythm to work with academic texts, and I don't think anyone simply knows how to do it the first time they try. What's more, different types of texts will lend themselves to different approaches. Experiment with these ideas, and be confident that the more you do it, the better you'll get. If you have questions, or if you find new ways that work for you, tell us about it. You can always book an appointment to have a chat with an LSE Life study advisor. Visit our website to find out more. In the meantime, I wish you all the best with your academic reading and with your studies at LSE.